right, good evening.
Good evening.
I'm not put this right in front of you. Okay. I did not start out as a student of medical history, as a student of medical historians. I am a practitioner. And I came to my practice in the place where all medicine should start, which is the suffering. We're having a little, let me see, over here. You all right? Is that better? Check, check. Okay. The experience of profound human suffering and disease. In this case, it was my own. I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia in 2010. I was 33. I had a 4-year-old and an 8-month-old. And I was already very naturally minded at this time. I was the sort of typical crunchy mom. My babies were born at home. I was living in the woods in Maine. I was doing the Weston Ray Price thing. It made no sense for me to get a diagnosis like this. And when you are diagnosed with AML, that's a do not pass go right in through the emergency room kind of cancer. It's one of the few cancers that's an inpatient treatment. And so they wanted me to do that, and I said, no, I'm gonna go home, I'm gonna figure this out by myself. I had this story that I was, I'd said, I'll never do chemo if I get diagnosed with cancer, which is an easy thing to say if you have not been diagnosed with cancer. Well, I went home, and I did what any good American would do, which was to start shopping. I bought juicers and supplements and books and all these things. But as I was trying to solve this problem, I could not find any information about how to treat acute myeloid leukemia naturally. There were some vague things out there about cancer, but in terms of the kinds of things you actually need to understand to deal with a disease of that magnitude, I could not get any purchase on the problem. It was as if no one had ever gone onto the internet and said, how might I cure acute myeloid leukemia naturally? It was like that question didn't exist. Ultimately, I was dying, I had young children, I went into the hospital, and I went through treatment, I went into remission, I relapsed, I went through treatment again, I went through bone marrow transplant. I had a bone marrow transplant a little over 10 years ago. During that time, I discovered homeopathy. And while homeopathy was not my primary form of medicine while I had cancer, there were some profound things that happened for me with homeopathic treatment, and the most profound one was the way that I recovered from the bone marrow transplant. And that is what brought me to the practice of homeopathy. And this, I'm not up here to tell my personal story, but it's important in this respect. When I started to study homeopathy, I was learning the art and the science of this incredible modality. But I'm also learning from all of these incredible homeopaths all over the world. People who are in India in hospitals treating cancer, people who are in Africa curing AIDS, which, these amazing things that are happening. And at some point, you start to think, why does nobody know this? Are we missing something here? And I found out why. I found out why I couldn't find anything about leukemia. I found out why nobody knows about these things. It is because it is illegal to talk about them. When I was a practitioner, I was asked to be involved in a legislative effort in Maine, which, as someone who's been so anti-government my whole life, was anathema, but I did it because Diane Miller runs an organization out in Minnesota, I think, that helps people make these safe harbor acts in different states. And what they do is they cover practitioners in unlicensable professions that are generally regarded as safe from being accused of practicing medicine without a license. practicing medicine without a license is a felony. You do not want to be accused of practicing medicine without a license. Now, someone in a profession like mine, what would happen is more likely that you would just be forbidden from practicing because no one's actually getting hurt. But the stakes are high. Those laws are on the books. They are written by the medical associations at the state level. And so I had to learn what the practice of medicine was defined as. Sorry. So, in the state of Maine, the practice of medicine is defined as follows. Diagnosing, relieving in any degree, or curing, or professing or attempting to diagnose, relieve, or cure a human disease, ailment, defect, or complaint, whether physical or mental, or of physical or mental origin, by attendance or by advice, or by prescribing or furnishing a drug, medicine, appliance, manipulation, method, or a therapeutic agent whatsoever, or in any other manner, unless otherwise provided by the statutes of the state. The hubris of one profession to abrogate to itself the definition of what it means to heal, and then to not do it, and to threaten you with jail should you step on their turf. It's so absurd that, like so many things I think that have come forward in the past 5 years for so many people, people don't believe it. You have to hear it. Everyone thinks you're exaggerating. It can't possibly be that crazy, but it is. And this is why we don't know. This is why you can't talk about these things. And during COVID, so the most important thing that I want to get across tonight, this is an enormous topic. I could talk for hours and hours and not be done, and so I won't. And what's going to end up happening is that there are going to be a lot of little fish hooks, and in the question and answer period, we'll find out which ones are most interesting to people. So anything that I give short shrift to, which is going to be almost everything, is my failure and not the failure of Coulter or my mentors, and just the breadth of this. But the most important thing that I want to communicate tonight is that when the COVID didn't break anything, it broke it open. And when we got to see that the corruption and the problems in the medical establishment, a lot of that came forward to people in the debate around hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And that was terrible, for sure, to interfere with the ability of practitioners to prescribe appropriately to their patients, to manipulate them, to punish them. But the alternative was hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. We were still very much within this medical paradigm. And what I want to talk to you about tonight, what I want to impress upon you tonight, is that this story is much older and much deeper than COVID, than indemnification of vaccine manufacturers, than in HMOs, than in Medicaid, than the Flexner Report. This goes all the way back to the founding of the AMA in 1847. And I knew during COVID, because I was connected with all of these homeopaths, we're running these clinics online because we work remotely. I work all over the world. That we were all of the time treating people who had this disease. I had clients in my own practice who were, I was very active with Maine Stands Up in Maine, which was the health freedom group in Maine. And I had clients who were in the hospital and their loved ones were able to get them homeopathic remedies under my direction and get them out of the hospital. So we knew that you could treat this disease. You didn't even need a prescription for anything. You needed homeopathy. but we couldn't tell you. If you went on the internet and said, I think I have COVID, what's the natural remedy for that? You would not be directed to these clinics that we were running. I mean, it was like $50 at most. You could get, you didn't even have to pay it if you couldn't pay it to come participate in these clinics and get treated for this disease. And some of the organizations that I was involved with were doing research and collecting the data on that. That's not what I do. I don't have that. But so I knew that we had this alternative, and that wasn't even in the conversation. That wasn't even in the debate. And so what's important to understand here is that Jeffrey talked in Pittsburgh about the Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, and the idea of the paradigm shift, and the idea that a new paradigm comes along and it overturns the old paradigm, and there's resistance to it, and it breaks through and it's adopted. What happens if the orthodoxy is so powerful that the new paradigm doesn't break through? Harris Coulter was he's just an incredible historian of medicine. I mean, these books that Brownstone has republished, they are not easy reading. They are not easygoing. They are not for the bedside table. They are worth your study because he demonstrates that there are two ideas that go all the way back through the history of medicine. Now, you thought that I was going to get up here and talk about the history of the hijacking of modern American medicine. And now, like Putin with Tucker Carlson, I'm going to take you back to Hippocrates for a moment. But hopefully not for too long, or we will be here all night. So he realized, he studied and demonstrated incontrovertibly that there are two ideas in medicine that go all the way back to the beginning of Western medicine. And one we will call the empirical or vitalist idea, and one we'll call the rationalist idea. And the medicine that we attribute to Hippocrates was what we'll call more of the empiricist or vitalist, but actually Hippocrates was not one person, and there are I think there are 4 folios that are attributed to him, and within the writings that are attributed to Hippocrates, we see both of these ideas developed. Now, obviously, the understanding of the human body was much more primitive in ancient Greece, but these ideas carry through pretty much intact. And what Coulter realized, what he concluded, what I believe he was saying in his work was that there was a moment when the better paradigm was ascendant and it was silenced. And that happened. It started in the 1840s, and the Flexner Report was not the beginning. The Flexner Report was the end. The Flexner Report completed that story and set us on the trajectory we're on, which I believe the importance of the moment of COVID to break this open is that we have the opportunity to move into a new trajectory. We recognize that even before the medical establishment, the pharma medico-industrial complex, had gotten corrupted to the level that it has, where you have doctors not allowed to serve their patients, that modern American medicine did not have anything but palliative options for people with chronic disease, for anything on the mental, the emotional, or the spiritual plane. And homeopathy considers the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual plane to be just all of the planes of existence at which you can manifest symptoms. That not only did we not really have anything for chronic disease, but that a lot of the treatments that our conventional medicine uses for acute diseases create iatrogenic chronic disease. So we already had this problem before we had the problem of what happened during COVID. And the two ideas are this. There are two different ideas of the purpose and practice of medicine. One, which we'll start with, is the rationalist idea. And it's the idea that the body is a complicated rather than complex system. So I know that Brett Weinstein's talked about this, and Jeffrey's talked about this. So a complicated system has a lot of moving parts, but you can, in theory, understand it. And you could figure out how to flip one switch or press one button and understand what is going to happen. Within that paradigm, the idea was to diagnose the disease, the problem, the invader, which back in the early days would have been something like, you know, a problem with the humors in your blood, or there's a wonderful cartoon that probably a lot of you have seen. There's this meme, and it's these two people in an exam room, and the caption is, wouldn't it be great to be an old-timey doctor and you're just all drunk and shit, and you say, you got ghosts in your blood and you got to go do cocaine about that. But you were lucky if that was the kind of medical care you got. Like, cocaine was the least of your worries. And so the idea was that you had this diagnosis, and then you were going to apply your therapeutic agents, which were whatever, purgatives or venesection or plasters or whatever, and you're going to remove the materia peccans from the body, and that is going to leave an intact and whole and well person. And the fact that this was not observed to be true did not seem to stop that train from rolling. The other idea was the empirical idea, that the body had a physis, or what we might call a vital force, which was unknowable, could not be known, was the animating agent of the body, was the thing that keeps us alive, and all we could ever really know about disease was its individual manifestation as the symptom picture in the person, which is how homeopaths approach the problem of disease. And so the idea is that instead of a diagnosis, you're looking at what is the prognosis of this disease. And your job is not to remove a diagnosis, but to apply this vital force is trying to keep the body alive. And that everything it's doing is an expression of its effort to keep the body alive. So the therapeutics that you're going to apply to that problem should work with that vital force in the direction that it is trying to move. And that idea is the problem with that idea from the perspective of a lot of certainly of Galen 1,300 years ago, and one of the reasons why we ended up where we are in medicine was that that's more of a layperson's practice. That's something that an artisan learns to do. You have to deeply know your patient, and you have to deeply understand your therapeutic agents. It doesn't put you at the same level of authority and echelon. So anyway, if I really go down this road, we will really be here all night. So let's jump forward to the middle of the 18th century and to Samuel Hahnemann. Samuel Hahnemann and these two ideas duke it out for centuries. And Coulter just documents all of it. And in the middle of the 18th century, Samuel Hahnemann is born. And the problem at the time that Samuel Hahnemann is born is that you still have these two ideas in medicine. The rationalist one is the one that is more ascendant. But part of the problem is that at this time, the empirical doctors, they have this better understanding of the human body, this vital understanding. But they still don't really have therapeutic tools that do this job. How do you actually communicate with the vital force? How do you speak its language? And so a lot of the reason that what they did was better is just because they did less. They worked with food, they worked with herbs, they worked with keeping you warm or cooling you down, but mostly they just did less. And the other form of medicine was this incredibly brutal approach of bleeding people and giving them mercury. Mercury was the #1 medicine for certainly all of the 19th century. In heroic doses, that was the argument, was that a good doctor would endure the suffering of his patient to give a heroic dose. And so this is, when I was diagnosed with cancer, I was young and strong. And I had a wonderful oncologist and then a very conventional transplant doctor who was good at what he did, but did not have the that same sense of humility. But I remember them saying to me, the good thing is that because you're so young and strong, we can give you more chemo. What they do is give you enough of a drug to almost kill you. And then they actually just pray. That's it. Maybe they give you some Neupogen, maybe they hope your white blood cells come back. But that was the first time I realized that even rationalist medicine is deeply faith-based. It relies on the vital force. Without the vital force, you give me that much chemo, you're never gonna see me again. That's it, that ship has sailed. I'm not coming back from there. 94 pounds, like I'm not surviving that. And so Hahnemann looked around and he said, he was an extremely intelligent, brilliant, accomplished, the first, if not still the only physician to have a statue memorial in Washington, D.C., and he wasn't in the United States, he was a German physician. He looked around and he said, all these doctors are brutalizing their patients, they're butchers, they're murderers. He called them that, which made him a lot of friends, and that was one of the, also part of the problem here by the time we get to the AMA. And so he stopped practicing medicine, and he became a medical translator. And if I got into the history and the story and the practice of homeopathy, we would again be here all night, so I'm not going to. But the point is that he solved the problem of a therapeutic agent and how it talks to the vital force and how it does the job of giving the vital force that information without ever having to know what a disease actually is or how that works. I'm just a medium. I'm like a vector for that communication. I take your case, I get a complete picture of the expression of the disease in you as an individual. I get a complete understanding of the expression of the remedial qualities of the remedial agent, and I just introduce them and they have a conversation. I just step out of the way and try to understand what I see happening. So he solved that problem. And he taught other people how to solve that problem. And then the cholera and typhoid epidemics hit in the 18th century and 19th century. And the conventional allopaths had nothing. They had no tools. People were just dying. And the homeopaths started saving lives. 60, 70%, they started saving lives. And people said, well, what is this? Not only does it not hurt, but it works. And it caught on. And a lot of those physicians started coming to the United States. So the most famous of whom was Constantine Hering. So there was an influx of these German physicians into the United States in the early part of the 19th century. And they started practicing homeopathy. They were all MDs, highly accomplished MDs. The medical schools of that day in Europe were much more sophisticated than they were in this country. And so they came to the United States, they started practicing homeopathy, and they joined medical associations, and they went out into the community, and they went directly to the patients. And they said, we have this amazing form of medicine that works and doesn't hurt you. And also your doctor is killing you. So that, again, we're not off on the right foot. And one of the big beefs that the allopaths had, and this is so interesting because I think one of the big things that's happened during COVID is that it's a period of revelation. The covers come off, the ability to play hide the ball. I mean, the ability is still there to some degree, but everyone sees that there is now something there to look for. And, they might still be trying to fool us, but we're determined not to be fooled again. And the allopaths were upset. Then Hahnemann coined the term allopathy. Hahnemann invented the randomized control trial. He was the first one to say, hey, we need to actually understand how these drugs work, and we need to understand how they work blind, and not just make up random theories and then apply them. And so the doctors did not want people having these conversations amongst themselves about what's better, homeopathy or allopathy. And now we are finally at the beginning of my story. We're in 1844. The homeopaths established the American Institute of Homeopathy, which still exists, that at the time and still now is only MD homeopaths. And at that time, you could be an MD homeopath because you could go through medical school and then go out and practice homeopathy. Now it is extremely difficult to do that, and in fact, a lot of physicians who have tried to do it have ended up having to give up or lose their licenses because they were not able to practice within their standard of care and practice what they perceived to be good care. So I am not an MD and didn't want to be an MD. And so in 1844, they established the American Institute of Homeopaths, and for two reasons. One is that when the homeopaths were starting to be so effective, a lot of allopaths, or we can call them rationalists. I mean, Hahnemann invented the word allopath, and he did not mean it as a compliment. Okay, I won't go on that sidebar, but it's interesting because the idea of allopathy as something that's not either the same or opposite, but just off in a different direction, isn't actually even necessarily how we understand rationalist medicine. But the homeopaths were concerned that a lot of people were starting to call themselves homeopaths who weren't practicing rigorously. Homeopathy's hard. It is hard to learn. It is hard to practice rigorously for chronic diseases. For acute diseases, and this was another one of the criticisms and sources of derision from the allopaths, for acute diseases, you can learn with some study, but just like anything else you would study as a layperson, to use homeopathy at home. A lot of homeopaths teach it. You can take courses. I teach it. I have a monthly club that we learn to think like a homeopath about healing and to learn a remedy at the level of a practitioner study. It's something that anybody can do. And so they were selling these kits. They were teaching mothers. Back in those days, if your child was sick and you took them to the doctor would just give them mercury till their teeth fell out. And this isn't what most parents wanted for their kids. And so they were going to the homeopaths. But what happens if you're headed out to the western frontier? Well, you could go to Philadelphia, which was the heart of homeopathy. It's where the Hahnemann Hospital was. It just recently closed. It had long since turned away from homeopathy, but it was still extant until a few years ago. And you could buy one of these kits, and you could buy the instruction book, and you could head out to the frontier. And then if your child got whooping cough, if your child got scarlet fever, if your child got pneumonia, you would have these tools. And so these two things, that this idea that everyday people could learn to treat acutes and that homeopaths could actually treat these serious chronic diseases, was creating a real problem for the allopaths because it was impinging on their patch. People were choosing homeopathy. And so in 1847, the AMA was formed. And the AMA was formed to ostensibly to improve the quality of allopathic education, because the idea was that obviously allopathic medicine was so much superior. I have a wonderful quote, which I'm not going to try to put my finger down right now, about homeopathy just fading before the bright sun of allopathy once people understood how great this was. And that the problem was that the public wasn't well enough educated. But the allopaths had to own that part of the problem was that their medical schools weren't doing a good enough job of spreading the message of how fabulous this form of medicine was. But what they were really about was boxing out the homeopaths and naturopaths and herbalists, but the only people that were really threatening them were the homeopaths. And when they established the AMA, up until this time, and still now, so there are these chartered state medical organizations. They have a governmental function. They have a governmental status. They license doctors. They set the rules about what is the practice of medicine. The AMA wasn't any of these things. It was just this trade organization that established itself and said, we want to bring all the state organizations underneath our umbrella, and we are establishing the consultation clause. And the consultation clause says that not only can you not be a homeopath and be in the medical associations, but you cannot consult with a homeopath. So you can't consult with another professional. And I mean, there are stories of husbands and wives. Homeopathy was a practice of medicine that women were medical doctors practicing homeopathy much earlier than allopathy. They were welcome in the industry much earlier. And there's one particular story about the wife is a homeopath and the husband's an allopath, and he gets censured by his medical organization. And so this was happening. It was a huge problem. The New York Times even ran an editorial saying basically the allopaths, the AMA would rather have someone die of a disease than to consult with a homeopath. This was back when the New York Times would, push back a little bit. So there was actually a lot of resistance to this at the grassroots level. But at the end of the day, the public was choosing homeopathy. They were continuing to choose homeopathy. Even in instances where it might be illegal to practice in some way, it wasn't a big deal. But as those of you in this room know, and of course in our larger orbit of people in the brownstone and otherwise dissident universe, that even if you can still practice, to lose your credentials from your professional organization and to be censured by your professional organization has major professional implications, not to mention personal ones. But this battle went back and forth. And now we come to the role the pharmaceutical companies played. Because, of course, any professional, the job of a professional organization should be to hold its members to the highest standard of care in whatever they do. But one of its other jobs always is to limit the competition. And I have a quote, there's this wonderful quote from a doctor who said about the founding of the AMA, "We must admit we never challenged the homeopath on the matter of doctrine. We only challenged him because he came into the community and took the business." And the idea that medicine should be different and separate from any other profession is one of the problems that we had over the past couple of decades of putting doctors onto a pedestal where the idea is that somehow they're above and holy and wouldn't be motivated by these things, and then to discover that they are and people are shocked. But just because the AMA wanted this doesn't mean they were going to succeed. The public was demanding homeopathy. The medical doctors themselves were adopting these practices in a more crude way. And what a lot of people, if you think about the practice of medicine now, what is often not realized is that a lot of the more successful and more commonly practiced medical procedures and drugs come from the homeopathic tradition. They're crude forms of the homeopathic tradition. We use carcinogens to treat cancer. We use mold derivatives to treat toxicity in the body, to treat infection. And they figured this stuff out using some of these principles. So the allopaths were adopting these things while they were denouncing them. And the pharmaceutical companies that even now, if you try to look up homeopathy on the internet and look at what Google is going to tell you, you will not get a picture of it that is favorable or honest at all. But pharmaceutical companies study ultramolecular potencies all the time. They just study them in ways that they want to try to patent. I had a client a couple of years ago who is an older woman. Her daughter's a friend of mine. She otherwise never would have consulted with me, but she had a kidney stone, and it was awful. And she went to the hospital, and they treated her for the kidney stone, and then she had all kinds of sequelae, and she was really, really sick, and really thought that her health was gone, and her life as she had known it was over. This is a woman in her late 60s, active athlete. She just wanted to sleep all day. She was in terrible pain. She would go back to the doctor. They gave her palliatives, and after a while, they told her to stop coming back. They said, "We don't have anything for you." So her daughter convinced her to have a consultation with me. I did an acute consultation. It wasn't even a chronic consultation. And I took the case, and I figured out what the remedy was. And it was something, homeopathic remedies are overseen by the Homeopathic Pharmacopoeia of the US. They are overseen by the FDA, but they are available. You don't have to be a physician to buy them. This was a remedy that she could actually get at the local health food store. She went out, she got the remedy. All of her symptoms resolved. 100% improvement in about 48 hours. $7 remedy. This is not, the math does not work. for pharmaceutical companies. But the pharmaceutical companies are really important to the story, and they are the linchpin. Pharmaceuticals have been around for a long time. Merck is a really old company. I think it was founded in the 17th century. The snake oils, the patent medicines, the patent nostrums had been around for a long time. And what happened in the second half of the 19th century was the Civil War. And at that time, war got more horrible than it had ever been. And the demand for antiseptics and analgesics and medical preparations on the battlefield rose, and the pharmaceutical companies rose to meet that demand. And around that was the introduction of proprietary medicines. So patent medicines, even the doctors were not using patent medicines, but proprietary medicines were essentially patent medicines that were a little bit fancier. They were prepared by pharmacists, and they were on the rationalist model. You would have a diagnosis, migraines, indigestion, diarrhea, whatever, and you would go and get this proprietary medicine that was going to solve that problem. They were marketing these to doctors, and they were marketing them to the public, but you didn't know what was in them. And then the medical associations, prior to this, the medical associations were publishing journals. And there are two major ways that medical associations, homeopathic, conventional, whatever, make their money. Memberships and their journals. And their advertising revenue for their journals. And the pharmaceutical companies with the proprietary medicines recognized that what they had to do was convince the doctors to prescribe their drugs. So they started advertising in the medical journals. And there was some recognition, and Coulter's very honest about this, there was some recognition within the AMA that there was an ethical issue with these proprietary drugs that did not have any explanation of what they were or how they worked, advertising in the medical journals, and they said, you have to say what's in the drugs. And that was the birth of intellectual property protected medicine, because what they did was they would then disclose what was in the drugs, but not in a way that would allow you to understand how to make them, how to use them, how to test them. A physician could not go and independently verify a drug and how it worked. Unlike in homeopathy, where all of our substances are generic and we can do it anytime. And so they started, the AMA had some resistance to it, but they really liked the money. And the ship sailed. And the pharmaceutical companies were writing advertorials. They were giving grants to the magazines to put people on the editorial boards. They were advertising, of course. Just like now, we had the medical journal that's actually just advertisement for pharmaceutical drugs. And what does any organization need if they want to influence the industry in order to box out their competition? They need money. They need to be able to give grants to the schools to limit how the practice is taught. They need to be able to curry favor with politicians. By the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the AMA was pulling in $150,000 a year in advertising revenue, and the homeopaths were pulling in $3. And there was just no hope. And so the allopaths then seized on that to say, we are going to limit what can be taught in the schools and who can graduate from the schools. And if you don't graduate from medical school, you can't be licensed to practice medicine. You have to graduate from an accredited school. And so they did this, and all of the homeopaths and the homeopathic colleges and all these schools said, you can't do this, who are you? Who is the AMA? The AMA said, okay. And they went to Rockefeller, and they went to Carnegie, and they said, you guys want to be in on the end of medicine, the big thing, chemical medicine. This is the future. This is going to solve all of our problems. And of course, these guys were connected in other ways through the byproducts of petroleum processing and other kinds of processing. But the big thing was what has become the foundations. I said, you want to be in on this, you want your name on this. And the senior Rockefeller was a huge fan of homeopathy and a user of homeopathy, and he had to be manipulated into getting on board with this. But John D. Jr. wanted it, and Carnegie wanted it, and they impaneled this committee, and they put the weight of their reputations and their money behind it, and Flexner came out with the report, which essentially limited and closed a huge number of the medical schools, which boxed out all of the homeopaths, a lot of the naturopaths, and also a lot of country doctors. It became much harder to become a practitioner of medicine, and really a lot of small communities lost their doctors too. So in homeopathy, we have our first aphorism is that the calling, the highest calling of the medical doctor, of the physician, is to restore the sick to health, to cure, as it is termed. And in the 9th aphorism of Samuel Hahnemann's Organon of Medical Art, we have the definition of what it means to restore the sick to health and to cure, as it is termed. And it is that the vital force may rule with unbounded sway, that we may be free in our reason-gifted minds to pursue the full purpose of our existence. That is the job of the physician. And we have lost our way, and we are now at the moment of being able to get back. And that is the hijacking American medicine.
Thank you. It's a remarkable story, and I'm suddenly struck. I'm sitting there listening to your story, and I'm remembering that my great-great-grandfather was maybe 3 times removed a medic in the Civil War because he was a blacksmith and he had the tools. You know this, right?
Saw bones.
Right. He could saw bones and saw off limbs. And then after the war, during the war, he invented his own patented medicine.
Excellent.
Which is called Strauss liniment. And I asked my grandmother what was in it, and she said, "Believe me, you don't want to know." So, anyway, remarkable story. Yeah, you can drink it. Right. Well, let's open it up, shall we? Yes, go.
Can you just repeat that last sentence that you said? The purpose.
The 9th aphorism.
Yes.
And I'm riffing a little bit. It was originally written in German, and I'm going from memory here. The health is that the vital force may rule with unbounded sway, so that we are free in our reason-gifted minds to pursue our true purpose of existence. There's nothing like it.
Sir, you were talking about in homeopathy use like mold derivatives and so forth as part of
Sure.
homeopathy, and that the allopathy was kind of poo-pooing homeopathy, but at the same time kind of stealing wisdom and knowledge from the
Absolutely.
homeopaths concurrently. Is there a bridge there from to allopathic vaccine?
Oh, sure. So Hahnemann was not, and we didn't get to this part about Coulter. I mean, the way that Coulter became really, I think, persona non grata is that he was the first one to talk about the DPT shot and the shot in the dark with Barbara Lowe Fisher, and to blow that story open. So I want to say that because this is, everything I'm saying to you is rooted in so much of his work and then in my study of homeopathy. Hahnemann was impressed by the idea of vaccination. That did not, Jenner wasn't, well, we don't necessarily know. But Hahnemann didn't invent that. He thought that it followed homeopathic principles. And I think that there's something now called homeoprophylaxis, which is, I don't practice it, but the idea is that you use homeopathically ultramolecular potentized doses of the way you would use vaccines. So instead of giving that crude dose with the adjuvant, which is designed to make the immune system so angry that it freaks out and fires off in every direction, that you would instead just gently say to the immune system, look, next time you see this, you'll know what it is. But I think that vaccines are one of the closest places where people can understand the crude application of that idea, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. This has been so interesting.
Sure.
You mentioned families heading out to the frontier.
Yeah.
And parents being given kits for whooping cough and other diseases. What might have been in those kits?
Okay. The basic homeopathic remedies, we have, there's thousands of homeopathic remedies, but for example, there would have, and homeopathic remedies are an ultramolecular potencies, so they are processed in a way that they don't contain the material substance. This is a whole separate part of the conversation, but so when I'm naming these substances, recognize that I'm not talking about actually giving people this stuff. But you would be looking at things like belladonna in a high fever, antimonium tartrate in a pneumonia, arsenicum in food poisoning, lead, plumbum. So a lot of the early homeopathic remedies, Hahnemann was studying the crude substances that were being used medicinally and saying, how do we, he was looking at iatrogenic disease, for one thing. He was looking and saying, all these people have been poisoned by these substances. Is there a way to cure them of that poisoning? And sometimes the homeopathic potency of the same substance would be curative. So those are some examples.
Thank you.
Sure.
What is the status of homeopathic medicine in other countries?
It depends on the country. So for a long time, it has been seriously under attack. It's interesting. The past decade has seen the intensification of attack. For a long time, people just mostly ignored us. We weren't really allowed to do anything publicly. It's the first rule of marketing, right, is that you have to be able to tell your customer the problem that you solve for them. But in homeopathy, you can't do that. So it's an interesting challenge. But so for the most part, people were just practicing homeopathy. And in some places, like England, so the royal family famously used homeopathy, and the Queen was in incredible shape. The Prince Philip and then the Queen died in short succession, shortly after certain pharmaceutical products came on the market. Until that time, she was very, very healthy. Homeopathy has had a strong presence in the UK for a long time. More recently, even there, it has been under attack. In France, it's used more regularly, but a little bit more in an allopathic way. In India, it's extensively used, even in hospitals. Again, in a combination of ways. But so one of the interesting things in the Indian hospital, if you can't afford the conventional Western care, then you get shunted to a homeopath who might actually save your life. So it really depends. Different cultures. It has not been big in the Far East, although it's making some inroads there. It was for a while taken off of the health service in Switzerland, but they put it back on after they ran a huge meta-study. You can't study homeopathy in the same way that you study other pharmaceutical drugs because you're not treating to a diagnosis. So you have to use different metrics in terms of the overall improvement of the patient and the individualized care. Because you're not going to treat every case of arthritis with Russ Talks. I had a case of arthritis in my practice 1.5 years, this poor man, I've been trying to help him. Every other problem he's ever had has not gone away. And then I gave him the remedy made from bamboo. And he lives in Georgia. And I gave him this remedy a couple of months ago. Sent it down to him. I ordered it from the pharmacy. They sent it down to him. And I didn't hear from him for a little while. And then the hurricane happened. And a hurricane is a true acute disease. We can use all the homeopathic metaphor and analogy and understanding also to think about social phenomena and physical phenomena. It's an incredible modality. I can talk about the election. I can talk about violence. I could go. But so the hurricane happened, and he is active in the Knights of Columbus and does a tremendous amount of charity work. And he was right out there in the field working with all these people who lost their homes. He still is. He texts me all the time. And I gave him that remedy. It fixed his hands. And then he got this call to service. And I said to him, the moment that the remedy was ready to arrive for you was the moment that your hands needed to be turned to service. That is the way this works.
Yes.
It is that magical.
Yes.
So, typically when you are working with a skeptical new client,
Sure.
okay, or you're in a situation where you're meeting some new people and you're trying to explain homeopathy quickly, you don't have like an hour and a half to really, expand with. People generally carry like very tightly this particular model of how medicine works or how illness looks, right? Which is in a lot of ways, I mean, for some of us, you eventually realize how arbitrary that actually is, how it's like, just sort of like bad luck that it ended up looking this very specific way. Modern medicine is not the product of noble, empirical, scientific pursuit. There's just all kinds of weird things that happen, right? Once you realize that, the floor falls out from underneath you a little bit, but then you can kind of look around and see that there's other models that are coherent and, are somewhat provable. You can do a thing, predict an outcome, that outcome sort of occurs. So my question is, when you don't have a lot of time to unpack this, and you're trying to communicate something that makes perfect sense within your head, within your context, but you know that they are still in this other context, do you have a way to quickly, are there metaphors that you use to kind of explain the switch that needs to be made?
Yeah. Well, it's always best to start with a story. When I discovered this work as shamanic is when I studied with some Karo shamans. And I thought, oh, this is shamanic work. And disease is a journey in the dark. And the framework of narrative, analogy, and metaphor is what this is. And so if you can start with a story, for instance, the first experience that I had physically with homeopathy where I was stunned with the change was not during cancer, because that is a long, deep, and slow process. That's not a switch flipping. It was when, it was in the middle, it was between, I was in full remission and then I relapsed, and then I was 4 years later. In the middle of that time, I got what might have been Lyme disease. I don't know. I was never diagnosed. My legs, my knees got swollen like softballs. I couldn't walk, couldn't bend my knees. I was in terrible pain. I still remember this whole time I've had young children living on one income. My husband is a timber frame carpenter, and it was just us in the woods with our kids. And so I was in bad shape, and people kept saying, you gotta go to the doctor. And I didn't want to go to the doctor because I had been to the doctor. And I was grateful for what they did, but I was keeping them in their box. So I went to my homeopath. And the first remedy she gave me helped a little, but not a lot. So I went back to her. Because this is part of the process, right? It's a dialogue. It's not instant, necessarily. Sometimes it is. It's amazing when it is, but I don't like to sell people a false bill of goods. And I went back to her, and she said, she looked at the case, and she said, okay, and she gave me a different remedy. And the results then were instant. The swelling went down, I got full mobility back in my legs, I was able to sleep, I was able to play with my kids, I felt fantastic. And there were three important aspects to that. One is that if this were just placebo, the first remedy would have worked as well as the second. The second is that if the protestation against homeopathy is that it doesn't work because it can't, then if it ever does, it does. All you have to do is show one random study from some rhinoplasties where they gave people arnica and their swelling went away, and the people who didn't get it didn't have that, and that you're done. That argument is over. Now you can get into the nitty-gritty of Is it appropriate to use protocols? Is it appropriate to use acute remedies in the acute expression of a chronic disease? These more subtle issues, and you can dispense with, does this work? Because you've already demonstrated that if it ever does, then the argument that it can't just doesn't. But the third thing, and this is important, this is often the point of entry, is the homeopathic understanding of disease is that the only way we know what a disease is in its expression in your symptoms. Now we have acute diseases, we have epidemic diseases, and we have chronic diseases. But all of them will express in a symptom picture that is somewhat individualized. And you want your practitioner to be focused on the unique individual expression of your case. And to not just focus on that in terms of understanding it and evaluating the prognosis, but to focus on it and understand it in terms of how they're choosing and matching a remedial agent. And only homeopathy works on that level of individuality on both the side of the patient and the side of the remedy. And so those are three really important points that if someone's going to get to the point where they're reaching out to me, and if they're skeptical, they're reaching out to me because they've run out of hope everywhere else. And so they're already thinking, well, I'm going to give something else a try anyway. If they're going to reach out to me, some of that is going to get across to them. If we're just having a conversation in an elevator, I have to evaluate how far I can go and where I can get. And those are the times I'm actually sometimes choke, because the level at which I want to talk about this is what our job is as a physician. But if you can get people into that conversation, they're hooked. Because no one has ever heard a doctor say that's the job of a doctor. And it is.
Sorry?
You pick.
Go ahead. Mark, go.
Just wondering if you've heard of Gerald Pollack,
Pollock.
Easy Water. Very interesting, he did these studies where he took material in the water,
Mm-hmm.
and then after the material in the water, all the material went missing,
Mm-hmm.
and the water remembered the qualities of the material.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have heard of that.
And that to me just is a beautiful example of how homeopathy has the potential to carry the information that allows for curing.
Yeah.
Just was wondering if you were aware of that.
Yes, and Emoto is the other one I'm thinking of, who did the photographs with just the words. And this, because homeopathy, whatever it is that's magical about water, is the homeopathy has a connection to that. And we don't know what the mechanism of action of homeopathy is, and Hahnemann didn't think we needed to know. He thought it was as arrogant to try to figure that out as it was to try to understand what disease truly was. And Dr. Iris Bell, who's this incredible chemist who does all of this research, what she endeavors to demonstrate and does successfully, and she has hundreds of papers, and if you get into Medline, you could just put in Iris Bell and read all day. All she does is show that different remedies react with different reagents in different ways, just to demonstrate that they react, that you can put different remedies in a dish with genetic material and get a response. Because again, she's just saying, look, we just know it does something, so let's dispel with that. So yeah, and Dr. Cowan's work on water, where he never actually mentions homeopathy, which makes me crazy, but that book, his book about water, is a beautiful reference, a beautiful discussion of this that you're mentioning. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's really powerful.
All right, one more. Who is it? Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
A long time ago, when Bornemann was bought out or merged with boron, Jay Bornemann, in a workshop, said, disregard the expiration date. They last forever. Is that true?
It's true unless they encounter something that is a problem for them. So they're sensitive to intense radiation. They're sensitive to really strong odors, camphor, peppermint. Some of you who know homeopathy have probably heard you shouldn't use peppermint. It's the difference between it's okay to use, like, to brush your teeth versus anything that's going to blow your sinuses out. They're fragile in that way, but they don't expire due to any degradation of their medicinal power. if they are preserved with alcohol. If they're not preserved with alcohol, eventually they're going to wear out. But you can graft a remedy from a remedy ad infinitum. And I teach people how to do this, and I'll talk to people like I'm giving a homesteader course. I've given a couple in emergency and acute courses, and what to do if you might be in a situation where you're dealing with stroke, you're dealing with heart attack, and help is minutes away. And how to take your basic stock or a community stock and graft that pretty much indefinitely. So there's a lot to be said on that side of things too.
I have a question about something that puzzled me in 2020, which is the strangest year of our lives. Right, so far, until the nuclear war.
I've endeavored not to go there.
Yeah. But there was this weird moment where this disease came along and everybody was panicking about it, and the word on the street was that we had to wait until the scientists from above invented this great shot that was going to fix us all, this countermeasure. And Fauci was asked a question, well, do we think that exposure to the disease confers any immunity? And he said, well, we have no studies about that. We don't really know.
Some people breathe Fauci lies.
Yeah, but I guess my question to you is, to what extent do you think the seeming absence of knowledge of natural immune systems was something preached by the elites, or do you think that there's a sense in which we, as a population, in the same sense we variously lost the cure to scurvy over the centuries, do you think there has been a kind of a society-wide forgetting about what it means to stay well, to be healed, that sort of thing?
I love this question because it brings in something that I wanted to mention and I hadn't had a chance to get into it. I want to talk about homeopathic thinking on a larger scale. So we're now several generations into the childhood vaccine program. And when I was reading A Shot in the Dark and thinking, oh my gosh, this is the shot that I got. I was born in 1976. And that one of the phenomena that we've observed over the past, maybe, let's say 10 years, I'm gonna get that number wrong, but is this increasing inability, especially among young people, particularly among young people, to accept in a way that would reflect a healthy intellectual immune system, an idea that is uncomfortable for them. So instead of having a normal immune system where you have your ideas, you have your beliefs, something comes in, it feels like an attack, you integrate that, you run it through your hide, you mount a response, and you walk away stronger. We have a hyperactive psychic immune system that completely goes blitzkrieg, autoimmune disease, shut down, blows itself up, no ability to absorb and integrate new information in a way that upgrades the intellect.
Safe space.
Metaphor.
I believe that it is not just metaphor, but actually a manifestation of what has happened through this practice over the last several decades. We forgot how to have immune systems because we actually physiochemically taught ourselves not to have immune systems, and we lost all of our immune system completely. And then something crazy happened in 2016. And that crazy thing was this phenomenon of Donald Trump, that whatever you think of him, he showed up and became the perfect foil for the projection of all of the pathology of society. And he served as a remedial agent that triggered an acute expression of the chronic disease, which was this massive explosion of everything that happened during his presidency. And then this suppressive agent came in. There was this suppressive response. We're always dealing with that in our culture. It's how we deal with problems. there was a suppressive response. It worked for a while, but the chronic disease was in an organism with a vital force stronger than the power of the suppression. And it roared back and said, no, we don't like this suppression. We don't know what we want, but we're blowing this up. Because this is not our higher purpose of existence. And that is what I think happened to our immune systems.